Welcome everybody! We're going to dive back into the world of WarCry here with making a nice little console for keeping track of your guys during the game. I'm Jason, the creator of the Tabletop Battlefield. Let's get started with this combination of 3D printing, a little bit of woodwork, and even some metal in here because there's some magnets going on. So here we are inside Blender. Now today what I'm going to do a little bit different is that I'm not going to do a super detailed step-by-step process. Instead, I'm going to do a bit more of a high-level overview of how I built these consoles for WarCry. If you want something that's a little more, like I said, detailed, a little more granular, and just give you the exact steps and keys you press, take a look at my custom WarCry bases video, as well as last week I did a 3D printed faction tokens. I'll link to both of those videos in the show notes below. But what I've got right here is I've scanned in an image of a WarCry card as well as a US penny. Now the US penny is going to play another role a bit later on, but initially I'm going to use it for scaling. So I'm going to create a mesh that is the proper size of a US penny, which is about 19 millimeters in diameter. And then what I can do is I can scale up my reference image such that the penny fills that entire mesh. And once I've done that, I know that the WarCry card is also the proper size for modeling purposes. Now there's going to be two pieces to each of these consoles. I'm going to have a card container which will hold the card in place on the board, and then in a little while I'm going to build kind of a cover for it. Now the card container is going to be made from two things. It's going to first have a mesh to it. It's just going to be a pretty standard rectangular mesh, and I want to model this to be a little bit larger than the card itself. This is going to act as a bit of a frame. Then I'm going to add a second mesh, and this one's going to be pretty close to the exact size of the card, maybe a little bit bigger. And this way I'm going to actually cut out a piece from that previous mesh I added, and therefore actually create a frame that has an open space in the middle. And once I've got both of the meshes created, I'm going to do a Boolean operation. So I want to select the original larger mesh, then go to the modifiers context on the right hand side, that's a little wrench over there, and then I want to choose Boolean operation from the modifiers, choose difference, and then select the inside smaller mesh. And what you might need to do is you might need to adjust the Z height, so just the height of the inside mesh that goes all the way through the outside one. And as long as everything goes right, which in this case it probably should, so when you hit apply, what you should be left with is a frame that approximately matches the size of a WarCry card. Now delete the mesh that you used to cut the thing out, so delete that inside mesh. And what you want to do is probably set the Z height of this outside mesh. So these are the stats over here on the right hand side. If those are not visible, you can press N on your keyboard to bring them up. And for the Z, I would say make it pretty thin, like maybe 2 or 3. Probably 3 is even too much. Let's do like 2 for 2 millimeters. And then print this piece out, so export this out as an STL file, and then print it on your 3D printer, and we're going to do a test fit to see just how well the card actually fits inside this little frame. After 3D printing this frame and test fitting it with a WarCry stat card, I discovered that the opening inside was a little bit too large. So I jumped back into Blender and I made some modifications by reducing the size of the open area within the frame. To do this, when I went into edit mode, now a free tip here is that when you edit certain vertices within a mesh, I do scaling, so I scaled things down a little bit. You want to scale first along the x-axis and then along the y-axis. If you simply select a subset of vertices in a mesh and then scale them all at once, what's going to happen is the Z height of your mesh is going to get all screwed up. Once I completed the size adjustment, I exported again, 3D printed it, and this time I liked how things fit. Let's move on to building the top of the console. Now the top of the console is kind of a difficult build here in Blender, so I'll walk you through it as best I can. But like I said, a lot of the details of how I would do this, I've already explained those mechanics back in some of my previous videos. But first things first, I've got a couple shapes I'm going to create that I'm going to use later for cutting out parts of the base. So the actual penny mesh that I created way back at the start, what that's going to be used for is I'm going to put several of those around the console. And those are going to be spaces where you can put either the wound tokens or have a die to track the wounds for certain characters that have, one card for multiple miniatures. The other shape here, a small rectangle, is going to be used to house a magnet. And that's going to be allow for the console itself to be attached to a steel base. We'll see more about that later on. Now, as for the main console here, what it needs to have is an opening in the top similar to the frame, but the opening's got to be a little bit smaller so that the card can't really pop out. Granted, you probably can't completely prevent it from popping out, but you can make it a little bit more difficult. So what I need to do is create a mesh now that's a little bit smaller than the card itself. And it's going to go all the way to the top of the console and create an opening for the card that should, between the frame and the card, pin things in place. Now you also have to factor in that frame is being there, right? So not only do I got to punch a hole using a Boolean operation for the opening for the card, but I got to punch a hole that's big enough that goes about halfway through the top of the console that will allow it to come down and sit on top of the frame. So you really got two different Boolean operations going on here, which can get a little squirrely. Later on, I have to go in and do some mesh surgery, which is something that, well, it's definitely way beyond the scope of this video. I think at some point in the future, I probably should go and talk about it because it's kind of an important thing to know if you want to do more complex 3D modeling and 3D printing in Blender. But then once you get that opening sorted out, I do experiment a little bit where I want those little holes for the dice to go. Eventually I decide I'm going to put them below the card. It's just kind of an arbitrary decision. That's what I end up doing. And I have 3 of them that span across the bottom of the card. And I'm going to use those to, once again, to punch a hole through the top of the console so that you can get access to the steel base below. It basically just create a little bit of a pocket to put, like I said, the dice or the cards or the tokens, whatever you may use. It's basically just punching a hole so you can put in the tokens or a dice or whatever you use to track the wounds on your miniatures. The last part then is needing to have a space for the 2 rectangles for the magnets. Initially I start with a very large rectangle for the magnets, and finally I work down to doing a really small hole for the magnet, hoping that just this tiny little piece of magnet will work in holding the console down. And long story short, it kind of does. The magnets I get kind of suck. More about that later. But you can always use more powerful magnets or whatever it may be. But once I've got this whole thing built, you'll see the completed thing here in just a moment. You're going to go ahead, export as an STL file, and then print it out. And of course, you're going to need one of these consoles as well as the matching frame for each unique card in your Warband. Fortunately, I play Stormcast Eternals, so I only have like 5. Oh, and one free bonus tip for doing Boolean operations. When you want to do a difference operation, sometimes, actually not sometimes, actually a lot of times, you can get better results by joining together all the objects that are going to be involved in the cut into a single object and do a single Boolean operation instead of trying to do like 5 or 6 individual Boolean operations. So the last thing to build in Blender here is going to be a dice tray. It's going to sit along the left-hand side of the tray, and it's going to be a spot for individual little slots here, so you can put your doubles, triples, or whatever it may be from, what do they call it, your hero dice at the start of the phase? Something like that. You know what I'm talking about if you play the game. So what I've done is I've taken 2 of my consoles, just kind of stacked them on top of each other as a size reference, and then I'm making another mesh that's going to be the actual dice tray itself. And I'm going to set that to be the height of these 2 consoles. I'm going to make it wide enough to hold a standard size die, which if I do things right, I think that's like 16 millimeters or something like that. I know 12 millimeters are the small ones, there's a bigger size, whatever. Then I make a single mesh that's the size of a die, or whatever die you're going to be using for this particular purpose. And then using the array modifier, I go ahead and I make 10 of them. And I spread them out vertically along this mesh I just created. I then turn that into a single object. And once again, I do a Boolean operation to cut the shape of those 10 dice out of the long strip here. And that's going to result in a piece with 10 spaces to put your doubles, triples, and whatever. So why 10, you may ask? Well, as far as I know, the most number of dice you can have is 8, 6 base, and there's ways you can get 2 wild dice. So in theory, you could have 4 sets of doubles, and you would want, well, I guess you'd really want 11 there, wouldn't you? Let me see, 4 sets of doubles. Okay, so you'd really want 11 spots, but I didn't have room for 11 spots. So 10 will work good enough. And then once you got this modeled, once again, export as an STL file and 3D print it out. And we've now got all our pieces together. I need to buy a few more things, a piece of sheet steel and some basswood. I'm going to go ahead then and build the actual tray. Well, don't forget these little pieces either. They're going to come into play in a minute. But anyway, all the parts for the WarCry War Console. Hey, that's actually kind of cool. I just thought of that right now. The WarCry War Console is ready to go. So let's talk about assembling all these pieces into a useful, meaningful tray that's somewhat magnetic and won't slice your finger open. That's very important. So as much as I'm kind of joking about slicing your fingers open, it's actually kind of true. Sheet steel, which I have down here, can be very sharp on the edges, especially if they cut into it. There's a little test cut there to make sure my tools can actually cut it. That's important. So that's where this basswood's going to come into play, but we will work with that in just a bit. So the first step here is to make things a bit magnetic. I've already done that to one of these. These are very crappy. Crappy is an accurate title. Little sticky magnets that you can buy from hardware stores where they have a little adhesive backing to it and they just stick to things. It's a very, very weak magnetic hold, but it's easy to use. For this purpose, it'll hold in place good enough for gameplay. Now, if you wanted to actually use this thing as a storage tray, you definitely want to upgrade the magnets. But for me, it's basically just kind of a test case for during gameplay so things don't move around a whole lot. These magnets will be strong enough for that. And I want to go ahead and put a magnet in each of the little slots that I cut into each of these console pieces here. Now it's time to start applying these 5 consoles here down for each of the cards. Now in my Stormcast Eternals Warband, I have 5 unique cards. That's why I have 5, but of course things may vary for your particular warband. So here's the process that I'm going to follow. I'm going to start by taking one of these kind of internal card holders that hold the card in a certain place, placing it underneath the console as to where it should go, placing the whole thing down onto the piece of steel here, and then very carefully I'm going to lift it up so this inside piece doesn't move. It's still where it was. Now this is where things get really tricky. You got to very carefully press down on the piece without moving it, and I'm going to trace out one of its corners, if not kind of 2 corners if possible. I'm going to pick it up and super glue it back down in place. We'll give that a minute to dry. Before I install the bottom row, I'm going to figure out what I'm doing here in terms of the far left edge. So I've got my dice tray down here. Now I want to mark out exactly where the end of my tray is going to end. And once again, I'm just doing that with the Sharpie pen that I have sitting around. And very carefully, I'll be taking some tin snips here and cutting through this steel sheet. That most certainly worked better in my head than in real life, but that happens from time to time. And in fact, that happens more or less every time. Now it's time to do something about the sharp steel edges. And for that, that's where this basswood is coming in. This isn't balsa, this is basswood or basswood. I guess I don't know how you actually pronounce it. What a surprise! I'm going to line the edges of the WarCry War Console here with this basswood. I think in the bottom, I'm going to lay it down like this, and that's going to cover up the extra piece of metal right here. And I'll probably put 1 extra piece of decoration. Then on the sides, I'll use some thinner material here. And then in the very back, I'll work on that in a minute, but I'm going to make that be a little tray to hold your little action cards. So I'm simply going to measure out each piece. I'm going to actually, let's see, we're going to line it up as best I can. And then I am going to precisely mark it with a knife. That's apparently a woodworker's trick. Pencils are not precise enough, but a knife edge is. And then I'll take a little jeweler's razor saw here. This is actually the Games Workshop Citadel one, and cut through this piece of wood. On the right hand side here, I have very little. I have this little piece right down here, but I have very little that I can actually glue this piece of wood to. Because I can't glue the parts to these little individual consoles, so they have to be able to be taken off. Alright, so what I think I'm going to do, let me glue in a piece right here, and that'll give me something to attach it to. For the left side, I'm going to cut it so I have an extra maybe inch or so up there, and that's going to let me do some adjustments in a bit. You'll see why I'm doing that in just the next few steps here. So this extension up here is to solve the problem the fact that the top has nothing to glue onto. So just like over here on the right hand side, I had to add this little extra piece of balsa wood. That's what that's going to be up there for. Now let's go ahead and glue on the right side. And then just like I did with the left hand side, I'm going to add a little bit of extra material up here. I'll deal with that later. Now it's important though that I only glue up to the end of the balsa and not glue up to where the 3D printed console piece is. So up here I'm going to make a tray to where you're going to be able to put your little action cards in. So I want to start with one of the thin pieces of balsa wood and cut that to fit. I say balsa wood, I mean basswood, basswood, whatever. For this piece, I want to make sure I only glue the very ends. Oh, and I can also glue right here too, where the dice tray is. I'm going to remove the consoles, and I'm going to flip this thing. Oh, shoot, one of them lost a little sticky thing already. Told you these magnets suck. Okay, remove the consoles, and we're going to flip this whole thing over. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take a strip of this basswood, and I'm going to run it so that it's just partially glued to this piece I just attached to the end right here. This is really a terrible way of doing things. I really screwed this design up, but that's what happens. I've got an idea to make things better and fix this whole screw up mess I've got going on. Here's what I should have done before I do my hack fix. All these things around the edges, they should have been on a plate, not being trying to attach to the sides of the plate. For some reason I thought that would work, and you know, if you had a thicker material like wood and not just sheet steel, it would have. But for some reason I just made something went wrong in my head, and I didn't think of that. So what I'm going to do is actually run some hot glue along here, and that's going to help hold the steel in place. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate this piece and kind of tilt it backwards a little bit. And that should let the entire cards kind of lean back a little bit, so it's a little bit easier to read. All right, let's pull these guys out and put some glue on the ends. Now comes the all-important test and likely fail. Well, damn, it actually worked. But with that actually working, I'm going to do one last little thing, actually two last steps. One is to clean up the wood in the back here and just kind of cut off the extra pieces. Take this as well as the consoles go on top, outside, spray paint it all, and we can call this project done. So there you go. That's one way to build a WarCry war console. That's my new fun name I came up for it. Here for your, obviously, WarCry Warband. So once again, I'm Jason, the creator of the Tabletop Battlefield. If you want to see more videos like this, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. And if you like this particular project, want to see me make more weird things and accessories like this, hit the like button as well. Give me an idea of what kind of videos you want me to make in the not too distant future here. I've got some other things to work on. I'm looking at a giant, big yellow box. There's a story behind that one. About yay high. It's about, you know, it's about that high, maybe a little bit less than that high. Anyway, there's a whole story out. It'll make sense in a few weeks here. But anyway, so until next week, thank you guys all for watching, and have a great week.